The alarm on my wrist device did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a soft chime, the kind used for calendar reminders, and that is the only reason I almost ignored it. I was standing in the mess hall of Outpost Cauldron, holding a tray of gray protein cubes that the Vicari called food, when the chime repeated 3 times in a row. That pattern was not a calendar reminder. That pattern was a private channel, opening on a frequency that belonged to someone else. I set the tray down and stepped into the corridor before anyone could see my face change. The message had no sender name. It was a fragment, 12 seconds long, clearly cut from a longer file, clearly meant for eyes that were not mine. I almost deleted it. Then the first frame loaded, and my hand stopped moving entirely. It was Grace, my daughter, 16 years old. Sent to the Vicari Central World 8 months ago as part of the first Human Youth Exchange Program, a program I had personally signed the consent forms for, a program our own government had called the safest gesture of goodwill in the history of our contact with the Vicari Dominion. She was supposed to be studying language and diplomacy in a guarded academic compound. She was supposed to be safe. In the frame, she was sitting on a metal floor with her back against a wall, and there was a mark across her cheek that no camera angle could soften. Her arm was wrapped in a medical binding that had been done quickly and without much care. She was not crying. She had her jaw set in that same stubborn line she got from her mother, the line that meant she was holding herself together by pure will, and that was somehow worse than tears would have been. The timestamp in the corner of the file was 6 days old. 6 days. I read it twice to make sure I was not misunderstanding the Vicari date format, because some small, desperate part of my mind wanted this to be a translation error. It was not. Someone had known for 6 days that my daughter was hurt, and no one had told me anything. I am not a soldier. I want to say that clearly, because it matters for what comes later. I am an engineer. I came to Outpost Cauldron 11 months ago as part of the Human Liaison Team, the people who kept the joint water reclamation systems running and made sure the fragile new treaty between Earth and the Vicari Dominion did not collapse over something as small as a broken pump. I was good at my job because I was patient. I was good at my job because I believed, genuinely believed, that if humans proved ourselves useful and calm and cooperative, the Vicari would eventually treat us as equals instead of as a species they had only recently decided was worth speaking to at all. I believed a lot of things 11 months ago. I walked back into my quarters and sat down at my terminal and made myself breathe before I did anything else. Panic would not help Grace. Panic never helped anyone. I opened a proper channel, one with my credentials attached, and requested a status update on all human exchange students at the Vicari Central Academic Compound, flagged as routine, because I did not yet want whoever was hiding this to know that I had already seen what they were hiding. The response came back in less than a minute. Automated. Clean. All human exchange students are in good standing. No incidents to report. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I did something I had never done in 11 months of careful, cooperative behavior. I went looking for the truth on my own. The outpost had a communications relay room that I had helped install, which meant I knew every access point in it, including the ones that were not supposed to be used by liaison staff. I told the night operator I needed to check a pressure valve reading, which was almost true, since the relay room did share a wall with the coolant system. He waved me through without looking up. That was the thing about being useful and quiet for 11 months. People stopped watching you. Inside, I found the log that the fragment had come from. It had been part of a larger security file, flagged for internal Vicari review only, routed through a channel that briefly crossed our shared network during a routine data sync 2 nights ago. A junior technician's mistake, probably. A crack in a door that was supposed to stay sealed. I would never know exactly how it reached my private channel, and in the end it did not matter. What mattered was what was inside it. The file was 11 minutes long. I watched all 11 minutes standing up, because some part of my body refused to sit down while I did it. There had been what the Vicari called an incident at the academic compound. A disagreement, the file said, between several human students and a group of instructors over a lesson regarding the natural order of species. Grace had spoken. I did not need the file to tell me what she had said, because I raised her, and I knew exactly the kind of thing she would say if someone stood in front of her and explained, calmly, that humans existed on a lower tier of the natural order and should learn their place accordingly. She had been separated from the other students afterward. The file called it a corrective session. I watched the timestamp count forward, and I watched 2 Vicari instructors escort my daughter out of a classroom and down a hallway. And then the footage cut. The way footage always seems to cut exactly when you need it not to. It picked up again 40 minutes later. She was on the floor of a holding room. Her arm was already wrapped by then. There was no explanation in the file for what happened in those 40 minutes. There did not need to be. I had seen the before and the after, and I had spent 11 years watching my daughter grow from a small, laughing child into the person sitting on that floor with her jaw set and her eyes dry, and I understood the shape of what had been left out. At the bottom of the file, under an authorization stamp, was a name and rank I recognized immediately, because I had shaken his hand at the treaty renewal ceremony 4 months earlier and told him what an honor it was to work alongside the Vicari Dominion. Commander Threxil Van. I closed the file. I sat very still in the relay room for what felt like a long time, though the log later showed it was only 6 minutes. 6 minutes. For 6 days of silence. For a girl who had gone to another world to prove that humans could be trusted, and had been hurt for exactly that reason. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that the version of me who had walked into that mess hall an hour earlier, carrying a tray of gray protein cubes and believing in patient cooperation, was not the version of me who was going to walk back out of that relay room. Something had shifted. Quietly, the way a foundation shifts before a building falls. No one else on the outpost could see it yet. I made sure of that. I closed the terminal, wiped my access trail the way I had learned to do while fixing corrupted sensor logs, and walked back to my quarters with my hands steady and my face calm, because if there was one thing 11 months among the Vicari had taught me, it was that the most dangerous version of a person is the one who has learned to look harmless while they plan. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the photo I kept on my desk, the one from the day Grace left for the exchange program. Both of us smiling at the shuttle gate because we believed we were doing something good, something that mattered. I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I opened my terminal one more time and began requesting an official meeting with Commander Threxil Van, using the calmest, most professional language I had ever written in my life, because I needed him to believe, for just a little while longer, that I still did not know the truth. That was the last quiet night of my old life, and I did not sleep through a single minute of it. The next morning, I put on my work uniform, and I made my hands stop shaking before I left my quarters, and I walked toward the administrative tower with the same even pace I always used, greeting the same guards I always greeted, saying the same polite words I always said. Inside, though, something colder than fear had settled into my chest, and it did not leave. I had 11 minutes of footage burned into my memory, a timestamp that read 6 days, and a name on an authorization stamp that I would not forget for as long as I lived. Commander Threxil Van was expecting a routine visit from a cooperative human liaison. He had no idea what was actually walking toward his office. I reached the outer doors of the administrative tower just as the morning light cycle brightened along the corridor, and for one strange moment I caught my own reflection in the polished metal paneling beside the entrance. I did not recognize the stillness in my own eyes. I had always thought of myself as a mild man, someone who solved problems with patience rather than confrontation, someone who believed that calm words eventually won every argument worth winning. That morning, looking at my own reflection, I understood for the first time that calm and harmless are not the same thing at all, and that a father who has just watched footage of his injured child can be both at once. The guard at the entrance recognized me and waved me through without the usual scan, because I had walked this same path 100 times before, always with the same folder of maintenance requests under my arm, always with the same tired smile. I gave him that same tired smile now. It cost me more than he would ever know. Somewhere above me, behind a door I had not yet reached, Commander Threxil Van was going about his morning exactly as if nothing had happened 6 days ago, exactly as if a girl's injuries and a father's ignorance were simply administrative details that had been filed and forgotten. I intended to make sure he could not forget them for very much longer. Commander Threxil Van's office sat at the top of the administrative tower, behind a door made of the same dark alloy the Vicari used for their warships, polished until it looked almost gentle. I had always thought that was strange, that they would take the metal of their weapons and shape it into something so smooth and inviting. Standing outside that door now, I understood it differently. It was not gentleness, it was confidence. They wanted you to know, even in something as small as a door, that the same material that could kill you could also welcome you inside, and there was nothing you could do about either choice. The door opened before I could knock, because of course it did. The Vicari did not believe in the small courtesy of letting a visitor announce themselves. Commander Van was seated behind a wide desk of pale stone, his long gray fingers folded together, his dark eyes tracking me the way a predator tracks something it has already decided is not a threat. He was not an unusually large Vicari. That had always struck me as odd, given his rank. He was lean, almost narrow through the shoulders, with a quiet, unhurried way of moving that I had once mistaken for wisdom. I understood now that it was simply the stillness of someone who had never once, in his entire career, expected to be questioned. "Liaison Cole," he said, using my surname the way the Vicari always did, without the courtesy title we used among ourselves. "This is an unexpected visit. I trust the water systems remain functional." "They do, Commander," I said. "I am here about a different matter." I watched his face for any flicker of concern, and found none. That told me something important. He did not think I knew anything yet. He believed the crack in the network that had sent me that footage had already been sealed, believed the silence around my daughter's injuries was still intact and airtight, and he was arranging his features for a conversation about pump maintenance or supply schedules, not for what was actually coming. "I need an update on my daughter," I said. "Grace Cole. She is part of the academic exchange program on your central world." Something did shift then, very slightly, at the edges of his mouth. Not fear. Irritation, perhaps, the particular irritation of a busy official being asked to explain a matter he considered already closed. "All exchange students remain in good academic standing," he said. "If there is a specific concern, you may submit it through the proper channel, and it will be reviewed in the standard cycle of 11 days. 11 days, I repeated. "And in that time, will anyone tell me why my daughter was moved to a holding room and given medical treatment for an arm injury 6 days ago?" The stillness in his eyes changed then. It was subtle, the kind of change you would only notice if you had spent 11 months learning to read a species that did not share our expressions. But I saw it. It was the look of a man recalculating, quickly, how much I actually knew. "I do not have that information in front of me," he said, his voice as level as ever. "If such an incident occurred, it would have been handled according to proper academic discipline. I would need to review the file before offering further comment." "Proper academic discipline," I said. "For what offense?" "I am not familiar with the specifics," he said again, and I understood then that he was going to keep saying variations of that same sentence indefinitely, because he had said them before, to other families, about other students, and it had always worked. The Vicari were a species that valued order above almost everything else, and part of their order was the quiet, absolute certainty that if a human parent pushed hard enough against a closed door, the door would simply stay closed until the parent grew tired and went away. "I want to see the file," I said. "That would require formal request through the Treaty Liaison Office," he said, and I noted, with a coldness that surprised even me, that his voice did not change at all when he said it. The same flat, administrative tone he might have used to discuss a broken conveyor belt. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, and in that moment, I thought about the day Grace had told me she wanted to go on the exchange program. She had been 14 at the time, and she had come home from school with a datapad full of information about the Vicari Dominion, about their architecture and their history and their strange, beautiful, layered language, and she had looked at me with an excitement I had not seen in her since she was small. "I want to be one of the people who makes this work, Dad," she had said. "Everyone keeps saying humans and Vicari will never really understand each other. I want to prove them wrong." I remembered telling her how proud I was. I remembered signing the consent forms 2 years later with a steady hand, believing I was giving my daughter the chance to be part of something larger than herself, something that mattered for the whole species, not just for our small family. I had believed, with the same patient hope I brought to every broken pump and every difficult negotiation, that good faith would eventually be met with good faith. Standing in Commander Van's office, watching him fold his long gray fingers together and repeat the phrase "proper channel" for the 3rd time, I understood exactly how wrong I had been, and exactly how much that mistake had cost. "I will submit the formal request," I said, keeping my voice as even as his. "Thank you for your time, Commander." He inclined his head slightly, already reaching for something on his desk, already dismissing me from his thoughts, before I had even reached the door. I let him. I wanted him to believe, for a little while longer, that I was still the patient, cooperative liaison who filed proper requests and waited 11 days for review cycles. I was not going to wait 11 days. I left the administrative tower and walked directly to the human quarters section, to a narrow room 3 doors down from mine where a woman named Nora Ellison lived. Nora worked in the Outpost's Data Archive Division, cataloging shared research between our 2 species, and she had access to systems that a water engineer like myself was never meant to touch. We had become quiet friends over the past 11 months, the kind of friendship built on shared exhaustion and shared distance from home, and I trusted her more than I trusted almost anyone else on the station. She opened the door before I finished knocking, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without a word. I told her everything: the footage, the timestamp, the authorization stamp with Commander Van's name on it, the flat denial I had just walked away from. She listened, without interrupting, her arms folded, her expression growing harder with every sentence. "There's a Vicari technician in the archive division," she said finally. "Someone named Illyra. She's been uneasy about something for weeks, ever since a batch of academic compound files came through for routine backup. I thought it was nothing. I think I was wrong." "Can she be trusted?" I asked. "I don't know," Nora said, "but I know she's the only lead we have, and I know you're not going to sit quietly for 11 days while your daughter sits in a compound run by the man who ordered whatever happened to her." She was right. I was not. Nora reached out to Illyra that same evening, carefully, through a private channel that Nora insisted was clean, though nothing on that outpost felt clean to me anymore. Illyra agreed to meet us in the lower maintenance level, a part of the station rarely visited by anyone above technician rank, 3 hours after the light cycle dimmed. I spent those 3 hours in my quarters, staring at the photo of Grace on my desk, running through everything I knew and everything I did not. I thought about calling Earth, about reaching out to the human government directly, about 100 different official channels that all led, eventually, back to the same closed doors and the same 11-day review cycles. Official channels had not protected my daughter. I was no longer certain they were designed to. When the time came, I met Nora outside the maintenance level entrance, and together we descended into a part of the station that smelled of recycled air and hot metal, past rows of humming servers and coolant lines, until we reached a small alcove where a Vicari woman stood waiting, her posture tense, her eyes flicking toward the corridor behind us more than once. Illyra did not waste time on greetings. She held out a small data drive, her long fingers trembling slightly as she did. "I should not be giving you this," she said, her Vicari accent shaping our language into something careful and precise. "But I have a daughter of my own, younger than yours, and I have read enough of what is on this drive to know that I could not carry it alone any longer. I took the drive from her hand. "What is on it?" I asked. "The full incident record," she said, "not the fragment that reached you. Everything. The instructor reports, the internal review notes, and the transfer order that Commander Van signed personally 3 days after the incident, moving your daughter to a secondary holding facility instead of returning her to the academic compound with the other students." My chest went tight. "Why?" I asked. "Why would he do that?" "Because your daughter did not stop speaking," Elira said quietly, "even after the corrective session. The reports say she continued to argue that the instructor's teachings were wrong, that humans were not lesser, that she would not apologize for saying so. Commander Van decided that returning her to the other students in that state would be, in his words, a poor example for compliant behavior. He ordered her isolated until her attitude, as he called it, could be corrected through further sessions. I stood very still in that narrow, humming corridor, holding a small data drive that weighed almost nothing in my hand and felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. "This was not an accident," I said, more to myself than to either of them. "No," Elira said, "it was a decision, made deliberately, by a commander who believed no human parent would ever see the full record, and who believed that, even if you did, there would be nothing you could do about it." Nora put a hand on my shoulder, and I realized my jaw had set into the exact same stubborn line I had seen on Grace's face in that footage, the line she got from her mother, the line I apparently had a version of too, buried somewhere I had never needed to find before. I looked at Elira. "Thank you," I said. "I know what this cost you to bring here." She held my gaze for a long moment. "Do not let it be wasted," she said, and then she turned and disappeared back into the maintenance corridors, leaving Nora and me alone with a data drive that contained the truth Commander Van had believed would stay buried forever. I walked back to my quarters that night through empty corridors, the drive held tightly in my closed hand, and for the first time since the chime had sounded on my wrist device, I felt something other than grief settle into the space where my old, patient calm used to live. It was not rage, exactly, though rage was part of it. It was clarity, a clean, cold understanding of exactly what had been done, exactly who had done it, and exactly what proper channels and 11-day review cycles were actually built to protect. They were not built to protect Grace. They were built to protect Commander Van. I sat at my terminal that night and opened the drive, and I watched the full record from beginning to end, every report, every note, every line of Commander Van's own handwriting authorizing an isolation session for a 16-year-old girl whose only offense had been refusing to agree that her people were lesser than his. By the time I finished, the light cycle outside my window was beginning to brighten again, and I had not slept at all. I sat back from the terminal and looked once more at the photo on my desk, Grace smiling beside me at the shuttle gate, both of us so certain we were doing something good. Something in me had finished shifting during that long, sleepless night. The mild, patient man who had walked into Commander Van's office asking politely for a file no longer existed. In his place was someone colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Someone who understood now that patience had never been the answer, and who had begun, without fully realizing it yet, to plan. There is a version of grief that turns inward and a version that turns into motion, and by the second morning, after Elira handed me that data drive, I had fully become the second kind. I did not cry. I did not rage in my quarters, or throw anything, or shout at empty walls. I made a list, the same way I made a list before any complicated repair job, and at the top of that list I wrote a single line: "Confirm Grace is safe right now." Everything else could wait for that. Nora helped me find a way to reach the academic compound directly, bypassing the official request channels entirely. It turned out that Elira, having already crossed the line that mattered most, was willing to cross a few smaller ones as well. Through a relay she still had access to in the archive division, she arranged a short, unmonitored connection to the compound's internal network, timed for a maintenance window when the automated logging systems ran a routine reset and left a narrow gap of a few minutes with no active recording. I sat in Nora's quarters with my hands folded so tightly together that my knuckles had gone pale, watching a countdown timer on a borrowed terminal, waiting for that gap to open. When the connection finally went through, the first thing I saw was a narrow, undecorated room, and the second thing I saw was Grace, sitting on the edge of a cot with a datapad in her lap, her head snapping up at the sound of the connection chime. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked on the single word in a way that undid something in my chest that I had been holding together through sheer force of will. "I'm here," I said. "I don't have much time. Are you safe right now? This moment?" "Yes," she said, quickly, the way children learn to reassure their parents, even when it costs them something to do it. "I'm okay. My arm is healing. They moved me to a different room 3 days ago, away from the other students. It's quiet here. Nobody talks to me. I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said. "I know what happened. I know about the corrective session, and I know about the transfer order. I have the full record." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked less like the composed, stubborn girl in the footage and more like the child I remembered, the one who used to climb into bed during storms because she trusted that nothing could go wrong as long as I was nearby. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping lower, "careful, are you doing something? You sound different." "I am going to fix this," I said, and I meant it in the most literal sense I could manage, the way I meant it every time I told her I would fix a broken toy or a jammed door, except this time the thing I intended to fix was not a mechanism, it was a debt. "Please be careful," she said. "He watches everything here. Commander Van visits the compound himself sometimes to check on discipline reports personally. Everyone is afraid of him, even the instructors." I filed that piece of information away with the same care I would give a critical measurement on a repair job, because it told me something important. He does not simply issue orders from a distance and let others carry them out. He comes to see the results himself. He takes a personal interest. That would matter. Later. I told Grace I loved her, and I told her to keep her head down and her composure steady for just a little while longer. And I told her that whatever she heard in the coming days, she should trust that I had not forgotten her for a single moment. The connection window closed before either of us was ready for it to, cutting off mid-sentence, and I sat in Nora's quarters afterward with my hands still folded, staring at a blank screen, feeling something that was no longer only grief. It was purpose. Over the next 2 days, I did something I had never done in 11 months on Outpost Caldron. I stopped being invisible on purpose and started being invisible with intention. There is a difference, and it took me those 2 days to fully understand it. Before, I had faded into the background because I believed cooperation required it. Now, I faded into the background because it let me move without being watched. I began by understanding exactly what the Vicari believed about humans, because that belief, I realized, was the single greatest weakness in the entire structure around me. They had built their treatment of us on a foundation of assumptions, repeated so often within their own culture that they had stopped questioning them at all. Humans were emotional but not dangerous. Humans valued comfort and safety above almost everything else. Humans, when threatened, would appeal to process, to committees, to 11-day review cycles, because that was what humans had always done in the 11 months since first contact. They had never seen what a human does when the process itself has already failed someone they love, and there is no committee left to appeal to. I spoke with 3 other humans on the outpost over those 2 days, carefully, one at a time, never gathering in a group large enough to draw attention. The first was a maintenance supervisor named Callum Reese, a broad, quiet man who had served in Earth's engineering corps before joining the liaison program, and who had once told me, over a shared meal, that he had left military life because he was tired of following orders he did not believe in. When I told him what I knew, Stripped down to the essential facts, he did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply asked what I needed. Access, I told him, to the maintenance tunnels beneath the administrative tower. I know the water systems there. I do not know the security layout. I can get you both, he said. The second was a young woman named Petra Voss, who worked in the outpost's small medical unit and who had treated more than one human student, quietly sent back from the academic compound with injuries the official records described only as minor incidents. She had not known the full scope of what was happening, because none of us had, not until Elira's drive. When I showed her the record, her hands shook, and then her expression settled into something hard and certain. I can get you something that will keep you steady, no matter what happens in there, she said. And I can make sure that if this goes wrong, there is a medical record proving exactly why it happened. The third was Elira herself, who I sought out again, despite the risk to her, because I needed to understand something only a Vicari could tell me. I needed to understand Commander Van. He is proud of his position, she told me, in the same low, careful voice she had used before. He believes deeply in the natural order he teaches, believes it so completely that he has never once imagined it could be turned back on him. He keeps a private office within his residence, separate from his administrative tower office, where he reviews what he calls difficult cases personally. It is lightly guarded, because he does not believe he needs heavy protection from a species he considers beneath real threat. That, I thought, standing in that humming maintenance corridor for the second time, was going to be his mistake. I want to be honest about what happened in the days that followed, because it would be easy to make it sound simpler than it was, easy to make it sound like a straight line from grief to certainty to action. It was not simple. There were long stretches of those days when I sat alone in my quarters and doubted everything, when I told myself that I was an engineer, not a soldier, that I had no business planning anything more dangerous than a maintenance route, that Grace needed a living father far more than she needed a dead one who had thrown his life away trying to prove a point. But then I would think about the timestamp, 6 days, 6 days of silence while my daughter sat on a cold floor with a wrapped arm, 6 days during which an entire system of proper channels and review cycles had quietly decided that the truth was not worth telling me. And I would think about the transfer order in Commander Van's own handwriting, ordering her isolated because she would not agree to be lesser, and something in my chest would go still and cold and certain again, and the doubt would recede. I was not planning this out of blind rage. I want that understood clearly. I had watched enough footage of angry men making foolish, reckless choices to know that rage alone gets people killed without accomplishing anything. What I felt, by the fourth day, was closer to the calm I brought to a difficult repair, the kind of calm that comes from understanding a problem completely and knowing, with total certainty, that there is exactly one correct sequence of steps to solve it. Callum mapped the maintenance tunnels for me over 2 long nights, tracing routes on an old schematic he had pulled from an archived construction file. Routes that ran beneath the administrative tower and connected, through a service corridor rarely used since the tower's original construction, to the residential wing where senior Vicari officials kept their private quarters. Elira confirmed that Commander Van's residence sat at the end of that wing, and that his private office was accessible through a side entrance meant for domestic staff, an entrance with a lock that predated the tower's more advanced security upgrades, because Van himself had refused to have it modernized, believing the inconvenience of a mechanical lock was a small price for privacy from the tower's central monitoring system. He had built himself a blind spot without ever realizing what it would someday cost him. Petra gave me a small injector, explaining carefully what it would and would not do, steadying nerves without dulling judgment, and a second, smaller device meant to interfere briefly with local security transmissions if I needed those few seconds of silence. I do not know where she obtained either item, and I did not ask, because there are some kindnesses you accept without demanding to know their cost. On the 5th night, I sat alone in my quarters and wrote a message to Grace that I did not send, because sending it would have meant admitting, even to myself, that there was a real chance I would not return to explain things to her in person. I wrote it anyway, because some part of me needed to put the words down somewhere. I told her that everything I had ever done, every long shift, every patient negotiation, every quiet year of trying to prove that humans deserve to be treated as equals, had all led toward this one truth: that a father's duty does not end at the edge of official process, that when every proper channel fails a child, someone has to become the last channel left. I saved the message and did not send it, and then I checked the small bag Callum had prepared for me, containing tools disguised as standard maintenance equipment, the injector and interference device from Petra, and the data drive Elira had given me, copied twice more and hidden in 2 separate locations in case the original was ever taken from me. I looked around my quarters one final time, at the photo of Grace and me at the shuttle gate, at the neat, orderly life I had built here over 11 months of believing in patience. I thought about Commander Van sitting in his private office, reviewing what he called difficult cases, secure in the quiet confidence that no human father would ever come looking for him through a side door meant for domestic staff. He had built his entire understanding of my species on the belief that we valued safety and process above everything else, that we would always, eventually, choose the comfortable path of official complaint over the dangerous path of direct consequence. He was about to learn exactly how wrong that belief was. I left my quarters an hour before the light cycle dimmed for the night, dressed in the same plain maintenance uniform I wore every day, carrying a bag that looked, to anyone who glanced at it, like nothing more than a set of tools for a routine repair. Nora walked with me as far as the entrance to the lower maintenance level, and there, in that same humming corridor where Elira had first handed me the truth, she stopped and took hold of my arm. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I do," I told her. "If this goes wrong, I need it to end with me. Not with you, not with Callum, not with Petra or Elira. Just me. That's the only way any of you can say honestly that you didn't know." She held my gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded, and she let go of my arm, and she said only one more thing before I walked into the tunnels. "Bring her home." I intended to. I moved through the maintenance corridors with the schematic memorized well enough that I barely needed to check it, past coolant lines and humming servers, through the narrow service passage Callum had marked, until I reached a junction that opened, according to the old construction file, into the residential wing's lowest level, directly beneath the domestic staff entrance to Commander Van's private residence. I stopped there for a moment, in the dark, with the weight of the small bag against my shoulder and the memory of Grace's cracked voice still fresh in my ears, and I thought about the 11 months I had spent believing that patience and cooperation were the surest path toward being treated as equals. I understood now that I had been wrong about the method, but not about the goal. Equality was never going to be given to us gently, out of vicary kindness. It was going to have to be understood, forced into their awareness, the same way every hard truth in history has ever been forced into the awareness of those who held power and assumed it would never be challenged. I checked the mechanical lock Elira had described, the one Commander Van had refused to modernize because he could not imagine anyone dangerous enough to need to worry about. I ran my fingers along its edge in the dark and found, exactly as Callum had promised, that 11 months of quiet, patient engineering work had taught me precisely how to open it. I stepped through the door and into the silence of the residential wing, and somewhere ahead of me, behind another door I had not yet reached, Commander Threxil Van sat in his private office, reviewing what he called difficult cases, with no idea at all that the last difficult case of his career had already found its way inside his home. The residential wing was quieter than I expected, lit by a low amber glow that ran along the base of the walls instead of overhead, the kind of lighting meant to feel restful rather than functional. I moved through it slowly, keeping to the edges of the corridor, my bag held close against my side, listening for footsteps that never came. Elira had been right about one thing already. Commander Van did not believe he needed heavy protection here. There were no patrols in this part of the wing, no visible cameras along the lower corridor, only the quiet hum of the tower's climate systems, and the soft amber light guiding me toward the door at the far end. I reached it without seeing another living soul. The door to Van's private office was plain, unmarked, the kind of door that told you nothing about the importance of the room behind it, which I understood now was exactly the point. A man who never expected to be found did not need to advertise where he could be found. I stood in front of it for a moment, and I thought, briefly, about Grace's voice through that flickering connection 2 days earlier, telling me to be careful, telling me that even the instructors were afraid of him. I was not afraid of him. I had passed through fear somewhere in the maintenance tunnels behind me, and what remained now was something quieter and far more settled. I used the small interference device Petra had given me, holding it against the frame of the door for the few seconds it needed to disrupt the narrow local security loop that Alira had told me still monitored this specific entrance, the one blind spot in an otherwise standard system. A small light on the device shifted from red to green, and I opened the door. Commander Threxel Van sat behind a low, curved desk on the far side of the room, exactly as Alira had described, a data screen glowing in front of him, his long gray fingers moving across its surface as he reviewed whatever difficult case currently occupied his attention. He did not look up immediately. The door, apparently, did not make the sound he expected an intruder to make, and for 2 or 3 full seconds he simply continued reading, unaware that anything in his world had changed. Then he looked up, and I watched the recognition cross his face, followed almost immediately by confusion, because nothing about a mid-level human water engineer standing uninvited in his private residence made sense within the framework he had built his entire life upon. "Liaison Cole," he said, his voice carrying the same flat administrative tone from our meeting 2 days earlier, though there was an edge beneath it now, a question he had not yet decided how urgent it was. "This is a restricted residence. How did you gain entry?" "The same way you underestimated everything else about my people," I said, carefully, and without you noticing. His hand moved, slowly, toward a panel on the edge of his desk, and I understood immediately what that panel was. "I would not," I said. "I have already disrupted the local loop on this door. Whatever alert you are reaching for will not go where you think it will go, not before we finish this conversation." His hand stopped, hovering just above the panel, and for the first time since I had met him, I watched something flicker behind Commander Van's eyes that looked genuinely uncertain. "What is it you want?" he asked. "I want you to understand exactly what you did," I said, and I set the bag down beside me, deliberately, so that both my hands were visible, so that he would understand this was not going to be a hurried, panicked confrontation, but something slower and far more deliberate than that. "I have the full record, the corrective session, the transfer order in your own handwriting. I know why you isolated my daughter, and I know it was not for any offense against your academy's rules. It was because she refused to agree that she was lesser than you." His expression settled, and I watched him make a decision, watched him choose the path he had always chosen with humans, the path of calm, condescending explanation, because he genuinely believed, even now, that this was simply another negotiation he could manage his way through. "She was disrespectful during a formal lesson," he said. "Discipline was required to maintain order among the other students. This is a standard practice within our academic system, applied consistently to Vicari students as well as human ones. I would ask that you consider the matter in its proper context before drawing conclusions." "Proper context," I repeated. "My daughter is 16 years old. She came to your world believing in the goodwill of the exchange program. She was hurt, and then hidden away, and then lied about, for 6 days, while I was told there was nothing to report. The information was withheld pending internal review," he said, as though reciting a line from a manual. "This is standard procedure to avoid unnecessary escalation before facts are confirmed." "Unnecessary escalation," I said, and something in my voice must have changed, because for the first time he leaned back slightly in his chair, the confidence in his posture thinning by some small but noticeable degree. You authorized her isolation because she would not submit to being called lesser. You knew what that isolation would look like when you signed the order. You have known for 6 days, and in that time, you looked me in the eyes in your tower office and told me you had no information in front of you. I was following established process, he said, and there was something almost rehearsed in the way he said it, as though the phrase itself was meant to end the conversation, the same way it had ended 100 conversations with 100 other worried parents who had eventually accepted the closed door and gone quietly home. I looked at him for a long moment, and I thought about every quiet, patient month I had spent on this outpost, believing that process and proper channels were the surest path toward being treated as an equal, and I understood, standing there in his private office, that he had never once, in his entire career, imagined that a human parent might walk through his own front door instead of waiting outside a closed one. You built your whole system on the belief that we would always choose the safe path, I said, that we valued comfort more than consequence, that no matter what you did to us, we would file the proper request and wait the 11 days and accept whatever answer you eventually chose to give us. His fingers tightened slightly against the edge of his desk. That belief has always served us well, he said, and there was, for the first time, a thread of something sharper in his voice, something closer to the contempt I imagine he had always carried beneath the careful administrative calm, contempt he had simply never needed to show before. Your species is new to us, Liaison Cole, new and emotional and easily managed, provided one understands which levers to use. Your daughter was managed. You are being managed now, in this very room, whether you realize it or not, because, in a matter of moments, security personnel will notice the gap in this door's monitoring and respond, and you will be removed from this residence and from this outpost, and nothing about your daughter's situation will change in the slightest. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it was not rage, though I had expected rage. It was something colder and more final than that, a quiet certainty settling into place, the same certainty I felt whenever I finally understood the exact fault in a broken system and knew precisely what needed to happen next to correct it. You are wrong about one thing, I said. This conversation is not the part where I am asking you to change anything. His hand moved again, faster this time, toward the panel on his desk, and I understood that whatever calm calculation he had been running had finally reached its end, that he had finally recognized, far too late, that the man standing in front of him was not the patient liaison who had asked politely for a file 2 days earlier. What happened next was quick, and I do not intend to describe it with any pride, because there was none in it. There was only the plain, final math of a father who had run out of other options, and a man who had spent his entire life certain that no consequence would ever reach him inside his own home. I moved before his hand reached the panel. The room was small, the desk close, and 11 months of quiet, patient engineering work had given me a steadiness that surprised even him in the last seconds he had left to be surprised by anything at all. When it was finished, the room was very quiet. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, looking down at what remained of Commander Threxel Van on the floor of the office he had believed no consequence could ever reach, and I felt none of the relief I might once have imagined feeling. I felt only a vast, exhausted stillness, the kind that comes after a long and necessary repair, when the broken thing has finally been fixed, even though fixing it cost far more than it should ever have needed to. Somewhere above me, through the walls of the residential wing, I heard the first faint sound of an alarm beginning to rise, slow and rhythmic, the tower's security systems finally noticing the gap Petra's device had carved into the local loop, finally understanding that something inside Commander Van's private residence had gone very wrong. I picked up my bag. I looked once more at the floor of that quiet office, at the man who had signed a transfer order in his own steady handwriting, believing it would never be seen by anyone who mattered, and I thought of Grace, sitting on a narrow cot on the other side of the sky, waiting for a father who had promised, without quite saying it in those words, that he would find a way to make this right. The alarm rose louder, spreading now through the corridors beyond the door, and I understood that whatever quiet, invisible version of myself had carried me this far was about to end. There would be no slipping back through the maintenance tunnels unnoticed now. There would be no returning to the mild, patient liaison who filed proper requests and waited 11 days for review. I stepped out of Commander Van's office and into the rising sound of the alarm, and for the first time since that soft, mistaken chime had sounded on my wrist device days earlier, I did not feel afraid of what was coming next. I felt ready for it. I did not run. I want that understood clearly, because in the version of this story that spread afterward across both human and Vicari networks, some tellings imagined a desperate escape through the tunnels, a chase through the residential wing, a man fighting his way back to freedom. That is not what happened. I walked out of the residential wing and into the open corridor beyond it, and I stood there, quite still, with my bag at my feet, when the first security response team arrived. They did not know what to do with me at first. I think that surprised them more than anything else that night. A human, standing calmly in a restricted residential corridor, making no move to resist, offering no explanation beyond a single sentence that I repeated to each new officer who arrived. Commander Van is responsible for what happened to my daughter. The record is on a data drive in my bag. I would like it reviewed by someone outside his chain of command. They restrained me, of course, and took the bag, and took the drive, and I spent the following hours in a holding cell beneath the administrative tower, in a room not unlike the one I had seen Grace sitting in during that 11-minute file, though I did not let myself think too closely about that particular similarity. I was questioned, repeatedly, by increasingly senior Vicari officers, and each time I gave the same account. I did not deny what I had done. I did not try to soften it into something more sympathetic than it was. I told them what I had learned, and I told them why I had gone to that private office, and I told them, plainly, that I would do it again if it were the only path left to protect my daughter from a man who believed himself beyond consequence. I do not know, even now, whether that honesty helped me or made things worse. What I do know is that the data drive Illyra had given me, once it reached officers outside Commander Van's own circle, changed the shape of everything that followed. The Vicari Dominion, I learned during those long hours in the holding cell and the days after, was not the single, unified voice it often appeared to be from the outside. There were factions within its governing council, some who had always distrusted the treaty with Earth and welcomed any excuse to end it, and others, quieter but no less powerful, who believed the future of their species depended on genuine partnership with a species as unpredictable and resilient as ours had just proven itself to be. When the full record of what Commander Van had done became known, not through any official channel, but through Nora, who had copied the drive a third time before I ever left my quarters and released it, carefully and anonymously, into networks that even the Dominion's council could not fully contain, the second faction found itself with something it had never had before. Proof, plain and undeniable, of exactly the kind of quiet cruelty their treaty had promised would never happen again. I was not executed. I was not even formally sentenced in the way I had expected to be, in those long hours when I genuinely believed I might never see Grace or Earth again. Instead, something stranger and slower unfolded. A tribunal was convened, made up of both Vicari officials and, for the first time in the history of our contact, human representatives sent directly from Earth, invited to sit as equals in judgment of what had happened on Outpost Caldron and at the academic compound on the Vicari Central World. I sat through that tribunal for 11 days, the same number, I noted with a bitterness I could not entirely set aside, as the standard review cycle Commander Van had always promised and never honored. I told my account again, in full, before that assembled panel. Illyra testified as well, at great personal risk, describing the culture of quiet, accepted cruelty that had allowed a man like Van to rise to his position and remain there unquestioned for so long. Petra's medical records, Nora's testimony about the archive division's routine suppression of incident reports, Callum's account of how easily a human engineer had moved undetected through supposedly secure Vicari infrastructure, all of it was laid out, piece by piece, until the tribunal was left with a picture far larger than one commander's private cruelty. It was a picture of an entire system built on the comfortable assumption that humans would always choose patience over consequence, and that assumption, once broken, could not be quietly repaired. The tribunal's final decision surprised almost everyone, myself included. I was not returned to Earth to face judgment there, and I was not held indefinitely by the Dominion either. Instead, the Council ruled that I had acted outside the bounds of acceptable process and would be restricted from further service within Vicari territory, but that the record of Commander Van's actions constituted sufficient provocation that no further punishment would be pursued. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to an uneasy, practical acknowledgement that punishing me further would only deepen a wound that both governments now needed, urgently, to begin healing. The academic exchange program was suspended, pending a full review. Every current human student, including Grace, was recalled to Earth within the month. I was there at the shuttle gate when her transport finally arrived, the same gate where I had watched her leave 8 months earlier, both of us smiling and certain we were doing something good. She came down the ramp slower than I remembered her moving before, her arm fully healed now, but still favored slightly, her eyes finding mine across the crowded terminal before either of us said a word. I do not have adequate language for what passed between us in that moment, and I will not pretend to invent some. I simply held my daughter for a long time, longer than either of us probably needed, and neither of us spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said aloud that we did not already understand. It was not a simple reunion, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think a story that pretends otherwise does a disservice to what actually happens to families after something like this. Grace was proud of me, I could see that clearly, but she was also frightened by what I had become capable of, and there were nights in the months that followed when I would find her sitting awake, quiet, working through something she was not yet ready to put into words. We talked, eventually, more than once, about what it meant that her father had walked into a stranger's home and ended a life to protect her, about whether that made me someone to admire or someone to be a little afraid of, and I told her, honestly, that I did not fully know the answer myself, and that I suspected I would spend the rest of my life sitting with that uncertainty rather than resolving it. What I told her, in the end, was this. I did not want her to grow up believing that violence was ever the first answer, or a good one, or something to be sought out. I wanted her to understand that it had been my very last answer, reached only after every gentler path had been deliberately, systematically closed by people who believed our patience would never run out. I told her I hoped she would never need to learn what I had learned that night in Commander Van's office, and that if the two of us had done anything worthwhile together, it was proving that we would not simply accept a closed door as the final word. The ripples of what happened on Outpost Caldron reached further than I expected, further than a single father and a single commander and a single tribunal. Within the Vicari Dominion, the incident became a quiet but persistent argument for reform, cited by the reform faction on the council whenever they pushed for greater transparency in how human exchange programs and joint outposts were managed. Within Earth's own government, it became something else entirely, a case study that circulated among diplomats and military planners alike, proof that the old assumption, held by more than one alien power we had encountered since first contact, that humanity's emotional nature made us predictable and easily controlled, was not simply wrong, but dangerously wrong, the kind of wrong that could cost a species everything if it built policy upon it. I heard secondhand, through channels I no longer had much access to after the tribunal, that Vicari instructors at the reformed academic compound now taught a very different lesson to new arrivals, one that made careful mention, without ever using my name directly, of the danger in mistaking a species' patience for weakness. I do not know if that lesson will hold, over years and generations, the way policies rarely do without constant tending. I only know that for one father, on one night, in one small office at the edge of the sky, an assumption that had cost my daughter 6 days of silence and an unhealed wound, finally met a consequence it had never once believed it would face. Grace is 17 now, and she has decided, against my quiet hesitation and her mother's outright worry, that she wants to study interspecies diplomacy at the university level, wants to be part of rebuilding the exchange program from the ground up, this time with proper protections in place, protections that exist, in no small part, because of what happened to her. I asked her once, not long ago, whether she was afraid to walk back into that kind of work after everything. She looked at me with that same stubborn line in her jaw, the one she has always had, the one I now understand I share with her more than I ever realized, and she told me that she was not going to let one bad commander decide the shape of the rest of her life, any more than she was going to let me carry the full weight of what happened to her, without ever putting some of it down myself. I think about that conversation often. I think about the 11 months of patient, careful cooperation that came before the chime on my wrist device, and I think about the 11 days of tribunal that came after, and I think, more than anything, about the simple, unglamorous truth at the center of all of it. I am not a soldier. I never wanted to be the kind of man capable of what I did in that quiet office. I became that man because every gentler path had been closed to me, one proper channel at a time, by people who never imagined a father's patience could run out. They wanted to teach humanity a lesson in submission. Instead, they taught me exactly how far I was willing to go, and in doing so, they taught themselves something they had never bothered to learn in all the months of careful, cooperative silence that came before. You cannot build a lasting peace on the assumption that the people you have wronged will always, eventually, choose to look away. Some debts do not wait for 11 days of review. Some debts are paid in a single, quiet night, and the world that comes after is never quite the same